Daniel Mercer. 9 years of relentless work building the backbone of Halbrook Pierce, while no one even noticed him. He wasn't flashy. He didn't command the room with charisma. He simply made sure nothing broke. No portfolio collapsed. No numbers slipped through the cracks. Every morning before the city stirred, he was already in his office, scanning markets across the globe, protecting millions, quietly creating stability that the senior partners claimed as their own. The firm called him the spreadsheet guy, a joke for others, a lifeline for them. But the day the merger memo hit his inbox, everything changed. Conversations hushed, eyes avoided his. HR popped up like ghosts in hallways he had walked 1,000 times. And then, the call. Conference room C. No windows, no light. Just the 3 people who would decide his fate. In 15 minutes, everything he had built, all the invisible work, all the years of quiet dedication, wiped away. Terminated. 4-month severance, non-disclosure, non-compete. And the worst part? The man who took credit for Daniel's work, Richard Caldwell, smiled like nothing had happened. As the glass doors of Manhattan's tower spun behind him, the city roared, oblivious. But Daniel Mercer knew one thing. They had made a mistake. He wasn't replaceable. They just didn't realize it yet. That night, alone in his tiny apartment, with only the glow of his laptop, Daniel stared at the numbers he had built, numbers they thought they owned. He saw leverage. He saw risk. He saw opportunity. And in that quiet apartment, he began plotting. Not revenge, not yet, but a way to make them pay for underestimating the man they thought was replaceable. No one at Halbrook Pierce Investment Group ever noticed Daniel Mercer, and that was exactly how the board preferred it. For 9 years, Daniel arrived at the glass tower on Lexington Avenue before sunrise. While senior partners enjoyed slow breakfasts in penthouses overlooking Manhattan, he was already reviewing international market movements, scanning overnight Asian trades, and preparing risk assessments no one else had the patience or discipline to build. He was never the loudest voice in the room, never the one wearing the loudest suit, never the one shaking hands too aggressively at corporate galas. He was simply the man who made sure the numbers never collapsed. But in corporate America, quiet competence is often mistaken for weakness, and weakness gets eliminated. Daniel didn't come from money. He grew up in Dayton, Ohio, raised by a single mother who worked double shifts at a hospital. He learned early that stability wasn't gifted, it was engineered. While other kids obsessed over sneakers and video games, Daniel obsessed over compounding interest charts and biographies of self-made investors. By 28, he had a master's degree in quantitative finance. By 30, he was building proprietary models for Halbrook Pierce that quietly increased portfolio stability by 17% year over year. The firm never advertised that. Instead, the credit went to senior partner Richard Caldwell, the charismatic face of the company. Caldwell loved cameras, charity galas, and magazine interviews. He called Daniel the spreadsheet guy in public meetings. The room would laugh. Daniel would smile politely and go back to work. Then came the merger. Halbrook Pierce announced a strategic acquisition of a West Coast private equity firm. The press release promised innovation, growth, and a streamlined executive structure. Streamlined, corporate language for cuts. The morning the internal memo circulated, the office felt different. Conversations dropped into whispers. Assistants avoided eye contact. HR representatives suddenly appeared on floors they'd never visited before. Daniel wasn't worried. He had delivered consistent results for nearly a decade. His models had shielded the firm during volatile quarters. His projections had prevented millions in potential exposure during a risky biotech surge 2 years prior. Performance protects you. That's what he believed. At 10:17 a.m., his assistant Carla knocked softly on his glass office door. "Carla, they'd like you to see you in conference room C." No explanation, no agenda, just conference room C. Everyone in finance knows what that means.
Conference Room C had no windows. It was where careers quietly ended. When Daniel walked in, 3 people were already seated. Richard Caldwell, a woman from HR he'd never met, and Thomas Grady, the newly appointed COO from the West Coast acquisition. Thomas didn't stand to shake his hand. That was the first sign. Richard adjusted his cufflinks and offered a rehearsed smile. "Daniel, we want to thank you for your years of service." Years of service, past tense. The HR representative slid a folder across the polished table. Severance agreement, 4 months' pay, non-disclosure clause, non-compete for 18 months. Daniel didn't touch the folder. "There must be a mistake," he said calmly. "My division exceeded its performance targets." Thomas finally spoke. "It's not about performance, it's about alignment." Alignment, another word that means nothing. "We're restructuring around client-facing leadership. Your role, while technically valuable, isn't central to our new direction." Technically valuable. Daniel understood immediately. He was invisible revenue, and invisible revenue is expendable. He glanced at Richard, searching for even a fragment of loyalty. Richard avoided his eyes. "We appreciate what you've done," Richard said, voice measured, "but the future of this firm requires a different profile." Translation: they wanted someone louder, more marketable, more photogenic, less analytical, more theatrical. Daniel leaned back in his chair. For the first time in 9 years, he wasn't thinking about risk models. He was thinking about betrayal. "You're making a mistake," he said evenly. Thomas gave a small, dismissive smile. "We'll manage." That sentence lingered in the air like a challenge. We'll manage. Daniel signed nothing that day. He stood, buttoned his suit jacket, and left the conference room without raising his voice. On his desk sat the framed photo of his mother, taken the day he got his graduate degree. She had cried harder than he did. Failure wasn't an option in their family, but neither was begging. By noon, rumors had spread. A few colleagues sent sympathetic texts. Most avoided him entirely. In corporate America, proximity to the terminated can feel contagious. At 2 p.m., IT deactivated his internal access. By 3:15 p.m., security escorted him out of the building he had practically lived inside for nearly a decade. As the revolving glass doors spun behind him, Manhattan traffic roared like nothing had changed. Because for the city, nothing had. But for Daniel Mercer, everything had. That night, he didn't drink. He didn't rage. He didn't call anyone from the office. Instead, he opened his laptop at his small Upper East Side apartment and began reviewing archived data, models he had personally designed but never patented under his own name. The firm owned the versions inside their system, but the concepts, those were his. And Daniel Mercer was not replaceable. They just hadn't realized it yet. He pulled up quarterly volatility projections from the past 5 years. He compared them to public statements Caldwell had made in interviews. There were discrepancies, significant ones. Public optimism, private concern. Daniel understood something in that quiet apartment that night. Halbrook and Pierce hadn't eliminated him because he was useless. They eliminated him because he wasn't controllable. He saw risk too clearly. He questioned leverage too often. He didn't play the theater game well enough. And now they were exposed. The merger increased their short-term valuation, but also dramatically increased debt exposure. Daniel had warned them privately. They didn't listen, because the cameras were watching. By midnight, Daniel had outlined something dangerous. Not revenge yet, but leverage. He closed his laptop at 2:14 a.m. For 9 years he had built wealth for other men. Now he would build something for himself. And when Halbrook and Pierce finally realized what they had discarded, it would already be too late.
The debt beneath the applause. 3 weeks after Daniel Mercer was escorted out of Halbrook and Pierce, the headlines were glowing. Halbrook and Pierce announces historic expansion. New leadership, new vision. A bold West Coast Wall Street alliance. On financial news panels, Richard Caldwell smiled beneath studio lights, talking confidently about innovation, scale, and a stronger, more agile capital structure. Daniel watched the interviews from his apartment. He muted the television. He didn't need the commentary. He could read balance sheets better than anchors could read teleprompters. The merger wasn't bold. It was reckless. Behind the applause and press releases, the firm had absorbed nearly $480 million in structured acquisition debt, most of it tied to short-term floating rates, most of it vulnerable to even minor interest adjustments. And interest rates were not stable. Daniel had modeled 3 scenarios before he was terminated. In 2 of them, the firm survived with moderate strain. In the third, a 1.25% shift in borrowing costs combined with underperforming West Coast assets triggered a liquidity spiral within 9 months. He had presented that projection in a private executive meeting. Thomas Grady had dismissed it as overly cautious pessimism. Now, Daniel ran the numbers again, this time without corporate politics clouding the outcome. The assumptions hadn't improved. If anything, they had worsened. The West Coast firm they acquired specialized in high-growth tech startups. But growth had slowed. Venture valuations were flattening. Capital was tightening. And Halbrook Pierce had leveraged optimism like it was collateral. They were betting on momentum. Daniel had always bet on probability. There's a difference. By week 4 of unemployment, Daniel converted his dining table into a command center. 3 monitors, financial terminals, spreadsheets layered with scenario stress tests. He wasn't trying to destroy his former employer. He was studying vulnerability. Because vulnerability creates opportunity. Meanwhile, inside Halbrook Pierce, tension thickened. Mid-level analysts were drowning in integration work. Systems weren't syncing. Reporting structures overlapped. Departments argued over authority. And Thomas Grady pushed harder. Growth is perception, he told leadership during internal calls. We control perception. But markets don't respond to perception forever. They respond to numbers. In early May, a minor tremor hit the tech sector. Nothing catastrophic, just a correction, a cooling of valuations. Under normal circumstances, Halbrook Pierce could have absorbed it, but they weren't in normal circumstances. They were overextended. And the first crack appeared quietly. A mid-tier biotech investment from the West Coast portfolio announced delayed FDA approval for its primary product. Stock dropped 38% in a single afternoon. It wasn't devastating, but it strained liquidity projections. Daniel noticed immediately. He wasn't tracking headlines anymore. He was tracking debt ratios. When leverage is high, small drops become pressure multipliers. He opened his model and adjusted one variable. Liquidity buffer shrank 11%. That was fast. Too fast. By June, 2 more portfolio companies missed projected earnings. Nothing dramatic enough for panic, but enough to tighten cash flow. Inside Halbrook Pierce, Thomas ordered increased borrowing to maintain expansion optics. Short-term bridge loans, higher rates, risk stacking on risk. Richard Caldwell went back on television. Temporary volatility, he assured viewers. Our long-term strategy remains intact. Daniel almost laughed. Long-term strategies collapse when short-term financing suffocates them. But Daniel wasn't laughing. He was building. With his severance untouched and his personal savings intact, he quietly registered a new LLC, Mercer Strategic Analytics. No flashy website, no public announcement, just a framework. He wasn't interested in revenge headlines. He was interested in positioning. Through discreet industry contacts, former colleagues who still respected him, Daniel learned something critical. Several institutional clients at Halbrook Pierce were uneasy, not publicly, but privately. Pension funds hate uncertainty. Endowments despise volatility. And whispers about integration instability were circulating in closed-door calls. Daniel understood institutional psychology better than most executives. Big money doesn't leave at the first sign of smoke. It leaves when it senses fire being ignored. So Daniel began drafting something meticulous, a white paper. Not about Halbrook Pierce directly, about risk amplification in post-merger capital structures. Neutral tone, data-driven, anonymous case simulations. But every model mirrored Halbrook Pierce's exposure pattern. If the right people read it,
they would recognize the resemblance. He distributed it quietly to 3 former institutional contacts under the guise of professional courtesy. Within 72 hours, one of them requested a private consultation. That was the first signal. Meanwhile, inside the glass tower on Lexington Avenue, tension thickened. Internal reports showed rising debt servicing costs. Cash reserves were thinning faster than projected. Thomas insisted on aggressive messaging. Richard insisted on maintaining investor confidence. Neither insisted on reducing exposure. Ego is expensive. By late July, the Federal Reserve hinted at potential rate adjustments. Only a whisper, but in leveraged environments, whispers feel like thunder. Daniel ran his stress test again. This time, the liquidity spiral triggered in 7 months instead of 9. He leaned back in his chair. They weren't just exposed, they were accelerating toward exposure. And still, publicly, everything looked magnificent. Award dinners, magazine covers, strategic vision speeches. But applause can't refinance debt. One evening, Daniel received a call from an unknown Manhattan number. He almost ignored it. He didn't. "Daniel Mercer," the voice asked. "Yes." "This is Laura Bennett from Ridgeway Institutional Partners. We read your paper." Ridgeway managed over $22 billion in pension allocations. They were one of Halbrook Pierce's largest silent backers. "We'd like to discuss risk modeling services. Confidentially." Daniel didn't smile. He didn't celebrate. He simply said, "Of course." When the call ended, he stared at the skyline outside his apartment window. 3 months ago, he had been escorted out like a replaceable technician. Now, one of the firm's largest capital providers was calling him directly. Not for revenge, for insight. And insight is power. The irony wasn't lost on him. Halbrook and Pierce had removed the one man who truly understood their structural fragility. Now their investors were seeking that understanding elsewhere. Daniel reopened his models one more time that night. He wasn't trying to destroy the firm. He was preparing for inevitability. Because when leverage is stacked carelessly, collapse isn't dramatic at first. It's gradual, then sudden. And when sudden arrives, only those who saw it coming are positioned to rise. Daniel Mercer had seen it coming long before they showed him Conference Room C. They thought eliminating him would simplify the future. They didn't realize he was the one stabilizing it.
When confidence becomes panic. In finance, panic doesn't begin with screaming. It begins with silence. By early September, the mood inside Halbrook and Pierce had shifted from celebratory to cautious. The hallways were still polished, the suits were still expensive, the press releases were still confident, but the laughter had disappeared. It started with an internal liquidity review. Thomas Grady had ordered it quietly after noticing an uncomfortable trend in short-term borrowing costs. What was initially projected as manageable interest exposure had crept beyond forecasted limits. Debt servicing wasn't catastrophic, but it was tightening the firm's breathing room. Cash flow projections were now dependent on continued asset appreciation, and markets were no longer cooperating. Another tech holding missed earnings, then another, then a mid-cap renewable energy investment announced executive turnover. Each event alone was survivable. Together, they formed pressure. Inside executive meetings, the tone sharpened. "We need stronger messaging," Thomas insisted. "This is temporary," Richard Caldwell echoed. "The market is reactive. We remain fundamentally strong." But fundamentals don't argue in meetings. Numbers do. And the numbers were whispering something dangerous. Meanwhile, Daniel Mercer sat across from Laura Bennett in a private conference room 20 blocks south of his former office. Ridgeway Institutional Partners didn't waste time. Laura slid a portfolio breakdown across the table. "We need independent analysis," she said calmly. "We've increased exposure post-merger. Our board wants reassurance." Daniel didn't ask the obvious question. He didn't say Halbrook and Pierce's name. He simply reviewed the allocations. 22% exposure through layered funds, high leverage, compressed liquidity buffers. He recognized the structure instantly. Your risk isn't immediate collapse, it's timing compression, Daniel said carefully. Explain. When debt servicing accelerates faster than asset growth, flexibility disappears. You won't see the problem in headlines, you'll see it in refinancing pressure. Silence filled the room. You're suggesting vulnerability? I'm suggesting sensitivity. He chose his words precisely. Institutional investors don't respond to drama, they respond to probability. Laura leaned back. Our internal team hasn't raised alarms. Internal teams often model based on leadership assumptions, Daniel replied evenly. Assumptions aren't always aligned with stress environments. She didn't argue because she knew he was right. Within 2 weeks, Ridgeway Institutional Partners began quietly reducing incremental exposure to Halbrook Pierce's managed vehicles. Not publicly, not aggressively, but strategically. And when big money shifts even slightly, tremors follow. Back at the Lexington Avenue Tower, the first sign of real trouble emerged in the credit markets. One of Halbrook Pierce's short-term lenders declined to roll over a bridge loan at the previous rate. The new terms were harsher. Higher interest, shorter duration, stricter covenants. Thomas called it negotiation leverage. Daniel would have called it a warning. By October, internal analysts were working late nights recalculating leverage thresholds. The firm's debt-to-equity ratio had drifted beyond its historical comfort zone. Still manageable, but no longer comfortable. Richard Caldwell began canceling smaller media appearances. He focused only on major outlets now. Confidence had to look curated, but confidence is fragile when liquidity is thin. The tipping point arrived quietly on a Tuesday morning. The Federal Reserve announced a modest rate increase, just enough to tighten capital markets further. On its own, the hike wasn't shocking, but inside Halbrook Pierce's structure, it triggered automatic recalculations across multiple debt instruments. Borrowing costs adjusted upward, cash flow forecasts tightened, liquidity buffers shrank faster than projected. Thomas convened an emergency executive meeting. This is manageable, he insisted, but his voice lacked its usual edge. For the first time, someone in the room asked the question no one wanted to say aloud. What if refinancing becomes constrained? Silence. Because that was the scenario Daniel had modeled months earlier. Refinancing pressure, timing compression. Panic doesn't explode, it spreads. Within days, institutional clients began requesting additional performance transparency. Nothing aggressive, just clarifications. But clarification requests multiply quickly in leveraged environments. Daniel received 3 new consultation calls that week. Different firms, similar concerns. Word was spreading, not publicly, privately. Inside capital circles where billions move without headlines. Daniel wasn't campaigning, he wasn't exposing, he wasn't attacking. He was simply answering questions with data. And data was turning cautious optimism into measured doubt. By mid-October, Halbrook Pierce's internal liquidity team recommended asset liquidation of 2 underperforming holdings to reduce leverage strain. Thomas resisted. Selling now would signal weakness. Holding them preserved optics. Optics won, for the moment. But markets don't reward optics forever. They punish delay. The real shift happened when a major pension client paused new capital commitments pending structural review. That client managed over $9 billion in retirement assets. The pause wasn't public, but it was significant. Cash flow inflow slowed. Debt remained. Pressure intensified. In Daniel's apartment, the screens glowed late into
The first withdrawal.
The first withdrawal didn't make headlines. There was no dramatic sell-off, no flashing red banners across financial networks, no urgent push notifications lighting up investor phones. It happened quietly, and that's why it mattered. In late November, Ridgeway Institutional Partners formally reduced its exposure to 2 Halbrook Pierce managed funds by 8%. 8% doesn't sound catastrophic, but when you're managing billions in leveraged capital structures, even small percentages alter equilibrium. especially when they're the first. Inside Halbrook Pierce, the notification arrived as a standard capital reallocation memo. The language was polite, professional, routine portfolio balancing. But Thomas Grady knew better. Institutions don't rebalance during stability, they rebalance during doubt. He called an emergency leadership session. Who triggered this? He demanded. No one answered. Because there wasn't a trigger, there was a pattern. Performance softness, refinancing strain, increased transparency requests, subtle market hesitation. Richard Caldwell attempted calm. 8% is manageable, he said. We absorb and move forward. But absorption requires liquidity, and liquidity was tightening. The real danger wasn't the 8%. It was the signal. Institutional capital behaves like a herd. The first move rarely causes collapse, but it creates awareness. Awareness spreads faster than panic. Within days, 2 smaller endowment funds requested updated risk exposure briefings. Not withdrawals. Yet. Just questions. But questions force answers, and answers reveal weakness. Meanwhile, Daniel Mercer sat in a quiet midtown office he'd recently leased under Mercer Strategic Analytics. It wasn't flashy, no skyline views, no marble reception desk, just glass walls, clean desks, and screens filled with models. Laura Bennett sat across from him again. Our board approved further reduction, she said. Gradual. Daniel nodded. He wasn't surprised. You're early, he replied. That gives you flexibility. And the others? They'll wait. Why? Because no one wants to be second. Laura studied him carefully. You don't sound emotional about this. Daniel didn't blink. Emotion distorts probability. He wasn't lying, but he also wasn't indifferent. Halbrook Pierce had dismissed him as technically valuable. Now their largest capital partners were asking for his analysis. That wasn't revenge. It was validation. Back at the Lexington Avenue Tower, liquidity meetings were becoming routine. Debt servicing costs had risen again following secondary credit adjustments. Nothing catastrophic, but cumulative pressure was building. Thomas ordered cost reductions across non-essential departments. Hiring freezes, travel restrictions, marketing budgets trimmed. Publicly, the firm remained confident. Privately, spreadsheets were turning defensive. Richard began noticing something unsettling. Phone calls were shorter. Institutional conversations were more formal. There was a subtle shift in tone. Respect was being replaced by evaluation, and evaluation precedes exit. The second withdrawal came 2 weeks later. A university endowment reduced its position by 5%. Again, small. Again, manageable. But patterns are louder than percentages. Stock dipped another 4%. Analysts began asking cautious questions during earnings calls. Can you comment on capital outflows? Thomas responded smoothly. Normal market adjustments. But markets recognize strain, especially leveraged markets. Inside the firm, junior analysts whispered Daniel Mercer's name for the first time since his departure. He warned them, someone said quietly during a late-night recalculation session. No one listened. The irony wasn't lost on those still running numbers. Daniel hadn't been dramatic. He hadn't threatened collapse. He'd modeled sensitivity. Now, sensitivity was materializing. In his midtown office, Daniel received an unexpected call. A senior risk officer from a competing investment firm. We've heard your name circulating, the man said carefully. We're reviewing exposure across several counterparties. Counterparties. Plural. That was new. This wasn't just about Halbrook Pierce anymore. This was about systemic perception. Daniel scheduled the meeting. He wasn't hunting clients. They were finding him. Because in uncertain markets, clarity becomes currency. By early January, Halbrook Pierce faced a refinancing deadline on one of its bridge loans. Under normal liquidity conditions, rollover would be procedural. Now, it was negotiation.
The lender offered terms: higher interest, stricter collateral requirements. Thomas pushed back aggressively, but aggression doesn't improve leverage ratios. Eventually, they accepted revised terms. Short-term survival secured. Long-term pressure increased. When internal teams updated the firm's debt projections, the spiral window tightened again. 4 months. 4 months before refinancing pressure became critical if asset performance didn't reverse. Richard sat alone in his office one evening staring at Manhattan's winter skyline. For the first time, he considered a possibility he'd dismissed months earlier. Maybe Daniel Mercer hadn't been pessimistic. Maybe he'd been precise. But pride delays realization, and realization delayed can be expensive. Meanwhile, Daniel wasn't focused on the firm's day-to-day volatility, he was positioning for aftermath. He began developing a proprietary risk mitigation framework designed specifically for post-merger institutions with compressed liquidity buffers. He wasn't building it to target Halbrook Pierce, he was building it because the market would soon demand it. Pressure creates demand. Demand creates opportunity. By early January, whispers reached financial journalists. Nothing confirmed, but phrases like liquidity recalibration and institutional caution began appearing in trade publications. Confidence was no longer unquestioned. It was conditional. And conditional confidence is fragile. The third withdrawal came quietly on a Thursday afternoon. Smaller fund, minimal exposure, but symbolically powerful. 3 separate institutional reductions in under 60 days. Thomas stared at the updated capital flow report. "This is noise," he insisted. But his voice no longer convinced the room, because everyone understood something unspoken. The first withdrawal is manageable. The second is concerning. The third is momentum, and momentum doesn't reverse easily in leveraged systems. That evening, Daniel stood by the window of his new office watching snow fall over the city. He wasn't smiling. He wasn't celebrating. He understood what was coming. When leverage compresses and capital retreats, stability becomes scarce. And those who predicted instability become indispensable. Halbrook Pierce had believed removing him eliminated complexity. Instead, they had removed foresight. And foresight, once lost, is expensive to replace. The first withdrawal had occurred. The second followed. The third confirmed the pattern. Now, the market was watching. And once the market watches, it begins to move.
Liquidity under siege. January arrived with an icy calm. Manhattan streets glistened with frozen precipitation, but inside Halbrook and Pierce's Lexington Avenue tower, tension had replaced serenity. Liquidity meetings were no longer routine, they were urgent. Each spreadsheet update felt like a pulse check, measuring the firm's heartbeat against an invisible threat. Thomas Grady paced the boardroom, voice low but firm. "We need assurances. Call every counterparty, confirm positions, double-check collateral." Richard Caldwell leaned back, rubbing his temples. "It's already late. Everyone knows something's off. Even our largest partners are asking hard questions." The firm's internal communications now carried a subtle edge. Email threads were scrutinized, innocuous requests interpreted as signals. Small discrepancies triggered meetings. Staff felt the tension, even those far from finance. Meanwhile, Daniel Mercer monitored these ripples from his midtown office. He wasn't intervening yet, but he tracked every move. Capital flows, refinancing requests, internal memos, everything. The firm was squeezing itself into a corner, unaware that its position had already shifted. Then came the Thursday call. A key bridge lender requested early collateral review. Not defaulting, not demanding repayment, but reviewing. It was a warning wrapped in civility. Thomas's reaction was immediate. "This is unacceptable," he barked at his finance team.
Explain why they even have the right to question our positions." Richard tried to calm him. "It's standard procedure, but yes, unusual timing. We should respond carefully." Careful was now tactical. Any aggressive move risked revealing weakness. Any passive response risked appearing weak. The firm was trapped in a perception battle it hadn't realized it was fighting. Daniel noticed the pattern accelerating. Requests for information, subtle hedging by counterparties, minor withdrawals. They weren't isolated. They were cumulative. Liquidity wasn't gone, but it was under siege. By the weekend, Halbrook and Pierce convened an emergency strategy session. Every executive attended. Charts, graphs, and forecasts lit the room. Stress levels were high, voices sharper. Thomas tried to rally the team. "We've survived before. We'll survive now. Markets fluctuate. This is temporary." But internal analysts were whispering Daniel Mercer's name again. "He modeled sensitivity. Everything he warned us about is happening." A junior associate broke in. "We need cash buffers. Even a 3% capital flight could force margin adjustments on some positions." Thomas froze for a moment. The number wasn't catastrophic, but in a leveraged world, it signaled vulnerability. Meanwhile, Daniel was preparing for the next phase. He wasn't just observing, he was mapping exit points, liquidity stress scenarios, and potential system-wide consequences. His models weren't abstract, they were predictive, and the first signs of capital contraction were now confirming them. By Monday, whispers had entered the media. Financial newsletters cautiously reported some funds are reviewing exposure to Halbrook and Pierce managed assets. Officially, it was neutral phrasing, but unofficially, it was a trigger for more inquiries. Daniel leaned back in his chair, reviewing multiple scenario outcomes. The first withdrawal had been manageable. The second had set momentum. Now liquidity was under siege, and momentum was accelerating. The firm's largest challenge wasn't immediate collapse, it was perception. Because in high-leverage finance, perception drives reality faster than balance sheets do. And in this case, perception was shifting.
The tipping point approaches. By Tuesday morning, the tension at Halbrook and Pierce had become almost tangible. The trading floor, usually a controlled buzz of activity, now felt like a pressure cooker ready to blow. Every phone ring, every email ping sent a ripple of anxiety through the staff. Thomas Grady's confidence, once unshakable, was beginning to crack. He walked the floor, scanning monitors with a restless intensity, muttering about risk, collateral, and unknown exposures. Richard Caldwell tried to reassure him, but even he felt the unease. Daniel Mercer, observing from his secure location across town, had begun to see the edges of the perfect storm forming. His predictive models, which had been considered overly cautious, were now aligning almost perfectly with real-world events. He noted the subtle signs, marginal calls from lenders, minor withdrawals from hedge partners, cautious inquiries from regulatory bodies. Each seemed minor in isolation, but together they painted a dangerous picture. The firm's treasury department, typically a back-office function, had become the center of all operations. Analysts were running continuous liquidity stress tests, each scenario forecasting increasingly volatile outcomes. Even the smallest deviation from expected cash flow could set off a chain reaction. Then came the first direct challenge. A major institutional investor requested an immediate audit of positions in one of the firm's flagship funds. The timing was suspiciously precise, but Halbrook and Pierce had no choice but to comply. The audit team arrived that afternoon, briefcases in hand, and immediately began combing through accounts, spreadsheets, and internal memos. Inside, whispers of Daniel Mercer's name circulated again. "He predicted the stress scenario perfectly," a junior analyst murmured. "If this escalates, we're in deep trouble." Meanwhile, Daniel tracked the unfolding sequence with almost surgical precision. He noted the subtle interactions between lenders, investors, and counterparties. The first cracks were small, a cautious hedge here, a delayed transfer there, but their cumulative effect could rapidly snowball into full-blown liquidity pressure. By late afternoon, the firm's leadership convened another emergency meeting. Thomas, clearly on edge, slammed his hand on the boardroom table. "We need to stop the bleeding. Call every counterparty now." Richard tried to interject. "Thomas, the issue isn't just capital, it's confidence. We can't force them to trust us if the perception has already shifted." But perception was everything. In the world of high-stakes finance, rumors of instability spread faster than any official report. Even minor discrepancies could trigger withdrawals, margin calls, or sudden liquidity demands. Daniel, watching from a distance, began outlining the next phase of his strategy. The firm's leadership, in their scramble to maintain control, was unintentionally playing into the precise scenario he had modeled months earlier. By evening, social media whispers began to surface, carefully phrased but unmistakable. Halbrook and Pierce faces liquidity review. For the general public, it was vague, but in financial circles, it was a call to action. Partners began quietly shifting positions. The tipping point was nearing. Daniel leaned back, eyes narrowing. Everything was proceeding exactly as predicted. The question was no longer if Halbrook and Pierce would feel the full force of the liquidity squeeze. It was when. Pressure builds inside the walls. By the next morning, Halbrook and Pierce was a furnace of tension. The trading floor buzzed like an anxious hive, but now the air itself seemed heavier, thick with urgency and unease. Phones rang incessantly, traders shouted over one another, and every monitor seemed to flash with warnings that demanded immediate attention. Thomas Grady's hands trembled slightly as he reviewed the firm's cash positions. The spreadsheets told a grim story. Small mismatches in margin calls had now cascaded into larger liquidity gaps. Every corner he turned seemed to reveal another risk he hadn't accounted for. He glanced at Richard Caldwell, who avoided his eyes. In a quiet corner office, Daniel Mercer observed the chaos like a chess grandmaster watching pawns move predictably toward traps. His models had anticipated this precise sequence: lenders hesitant, investors questioning, and leadership scrambling. The beauty and cruelty of systemic pressure was that it unfolded naturally once triggered. Meanwhile, the audit team from the institutional investor had completed their initial review. Their report was concise but damning. Several unreported obligations, liquidity mismatches, and exposure concentrations far beyond prudent limits. It was enough to cause second thoughts in even the most loyal counterparties. As the news filtered through the firm, panic began to spread. Mid-level managers whispered in hallways about massive withdrawals and margin calls we can't cover. The employees who once felt secure in their positions now clutched their keyboards, refreshing screens, checking emails for directives, and wondering if the firm would survive the day. Richard tried to calm Thomas. "We need a strategic communication plan. We can't just react. If we signal panic, the ripple will be uncontrollable." Thomas shook his head. "Communication won't fix the numbers, Richard. Look at this." He pointed at a projection on the monitor showing the potential liquidity gap widening exponentially over the next 48 hours. In another part of the city, Daniel noted the pattern. The first cracks were becoming small fissures in the foundation. The confidence in Halbrook and Pierce's stability was eroding faster than cash flows. Even seasoned investors were pulling back, wary of being caught in a financial maelstrom. By midday, Thomas was on calls with counterparties, pleading, explaining, and negotiating, but every answer came with hesitation. Every promise included a caveat. The firm's leadership was fighting an invisible enemy, perception itself. Confidence had become a currency, and theirs was rapidly devaluing. Even as the panic mounted internally, Daniel's eyes were calm, calculating. The storm was reaching the exact intensity his models had predicted. Every action the firm took in desperation was actually reinforcing the pressure points he had identified. He allowed himself a faint smile. The machine he had built, the sequence of leverage, trust, and perception was working flawlessly. By evening, the first real signs of external pressure arrived. Hedge funds and smaller partners began quietly liquidating positions tied to Halbrook and Pierce. Rumors spread online, carefully seeded by market insiders aware of the audit results. The firm was teetering on the edge of a full liquidity crisis. Daniel leaned back, reviewing the timing and sequencing of every action. Everything was unfolding according to plan. The question wasn't whether Halbrook and Pierce would face a reckoning. It was how badly they would be shaken when it finally hit.
The dominoes begin to fall. By early morning, Halbrook and Pierce felt like a building under siege. The firm's reputation, once a fortress of stability, was now cracking under pressure. The phones wouldn't stop ringing. Traders scrolled through endless news feeds, refreshing financial updates, while clients demanded explanations they didn't have. Every keystroke, every decision now carried enormous weight. Thomas Grady paced the executive floor. His tie was loose, sleeves rolled up, and the tension was written across his face. If we don't stabilize liquidity within the next 12 hours, this could spiral completely, he muttered, glancing at a live feed of margin calls and incoming withdrawal requests. Every figure he saw worsened his anxiety. Richard Caldwell, attempting to maintain composure, gathered the leadership team in the boardroom. "We need a coordinated response," he said firmly. "Half measures will only amplify the panic. Every communication, every action must reassure and control the narrative. The perception is as important as the actual numbers." But inside, everyone felt the tremor of doubt. Even those who had thrived in the firm's competitive culture now questioned whether their positions were secure. Conversations in hallways turned into speculative whispers. Who was next to be cut? Who had exposure that would trigger the next domino? Fear became a silent, unrelenting force. Meanwhile, Daniel Mercer observed from a distance. He wasn't just watching numbers, he was watching human behavior. Panic, when orchestrated through financial leverage and strategic pressure points, was predictable. People would make mistakes, sell prematurely, misjudge risk, overreact. The chaos he cultivated was systematic. By mid-morning, the first domino fell. One of the firm's major counterparties froze outgoing payments, citing concerns over Halbrook and Pierce's liquidity. The news, once internal, leaked to other partners. Within minutes, a cascading effect began. Other firms started pulling back, large investors questioned commitments, and margin calls escalated. On the trading floor, the atmosphere became electric. Screens flashed warnings, traders shouted over one another, and senior executives tried to contain the chaos with emergency calls and hastily drafted memos. The firm, once steady and commanding, was now a tinderbox of tension. Thomas Grady, pale and sweating, attempted to reach a key investor personally. "We've had a temporary setback, but our fundamentals remain strong," he said, trying to project confidence he no longer felt. Silence followed. Then the investor's words cut deep. "If you can't resolve this in the next few hours, we're reallocating our assets. Consider this your final warning." In the corner office, Daniel Mercer allowed himself a rare smirk. The plan wasn't about destroying Halbrook and Pierce. It was about observing how quickly the carefully constructed edifice could crumble under pressure. Human nature, fear, and miscalculation were all catalysts in his design. By evening, the ripple effect was undeniable. Smaller partners and hedge funds liquidated positions en masse. Rumors spread in online financial forums and private investor networks. Panic now wasn't confined to the firm. It had infected the perception of the broader market. And yet, for Daniel, every collapse was a lesson in precision. The dominoes were falling exactly as he had calculated, each one amplifying the next, creating a crescendo of financial tension that no one inside Halbrook and Pierce fully comprehended. Leadership fractures and reckoning. The morning after the liquidity shock, Halbrook and Pierce resembled a battlefield more than a financial institution. Desks were littered with printouts, emergency calls echoed through the hallways, and the leadership team huddled in tense clusters, debating every possible response. Thomas Grady, once confident and decisive, now ran on sheer adrenaline. His hands shook slightly as he scrolled through the latest withdrawal requests and margin call reports. Every number seemed worse than the last. "We need immediate action," he said, voice tight. "Otherwise, this isn't just a bad quarter, it's a full collapse." But Richard Caldwell refused to succumb to panic. He pushed the team to focus on clear, actionable steps. "We cannot solve this by reacting emotionally. Identify critical exposures, secure liquidity, and communicate. Every word matters. The market senses weakness instantly." But even he felt the tension gnawing at the edges of his control. The cracks in leadership began to show. Junior executives argued openly about priorities, each blaming the other for overlooked risks. Internal audits revealed gaps in risk assessment, and compliance officers quietly questioned past approvals. For the first time, confidence within the firm's walls was fractured. Outside, the market sensed it. Analysts released reports speculating on the firm's stability. News outlets picked up the story, highlighting liquidity concerns at Halbrook and Pierce. Clients demanded explanations, while some quietly started redirecting funds. Each action, each hesitation, compounded the growing instability. Meanwhile, Daniel Mercer observed from a distance. He didn't need to intervene. The strategy he had set in motion relied on the very human tendencies of doubt and fear. He observed leadership falter under pressure, watched alliances weaken, and saw the first cracks appear in what once seemed unshakable. By late afternoon, a critical meeting erupted in the boardroom. Grady and Caldwell argued over whether to seek external capital infusion or attempt an internal reallocation. Voices rose, tempers flared, and even the most loyal staff realized their leaders were unprepared for the scale of the crisis. A sudden alert on the trading floor drew everyone's attention. One of the firm's largest positions had triggered an automatic margin liquidation. Hundreds of millions of dollars were being moved without human control. The ripple effect of one miscalculated risk was now visible in real time, a stark warning of how fragile the entire operation had become. Richard Caldwell slammed his hand on the conference table. "We are not just fighting the market, we are fighting ourselves." His words cut through the tension, momentarily silencing the room. But the damage was done. The firm's internal cohesion had weakened, and external pressures were only accelerating the unraveling. Meanwhile, Daniel Mercer prepared for the next phase. He had learned that once leadership fractured, panic became contagious. The next step would be to push decisions to the breaking point, forcing errors, and revealing which executives could adapt under stress and which would crumble entirely. As night fell over the city, Halbrook and Pierce's skyscraper seemed more ominous than ever, its lights flickering with the frantic energy of a firm on the brink. Inside, executives wrestled with fear, uncertainty, and responsibility. And outside, one man waited, calculating the final sequences in his financial symphony.
The morning sun fell on Halbrook and Pierce like a spotlight, exposing every flaw, every misstep, and every fracture that Daniel Mercer had been quietly exploiting. The firm's balance sheets, once sturdy, now trembled under the weight of compounded losses, bad decisions, and shaken client trust. Caldwell and Grady met in the boardroom, faces pale, hands gripping coffee cups as if they were lifelines. "We're running out of options," Grady admitted, voice tight. "Every move we make is reactive. We can't win against this storm." Caldwell exhaled, eyes scanning the room, every face etched with exhaustion and fear. "Then we don't try to beat the storm. We survive it. We focus on stabilizing our core clients, protecting what we can, and shutting down everything else until the dust settles." On the trading floor, the hum of computers, once comforting, now sounded like a countdown. Red figures blinked relentlessly across screens, a digital drumbeat announcing every financial casualty. Traders moved like shadows, executing commands with robotic precision, suppressing panic but feeling it gnaw at every nerve. Meanwhile, Daniel Mercer watched from his private office, the faintest smile tugging at the corner of his lips. Every prediction had been correct. Every psychological pressure point had been hit. Halbrook and Pierce was still standing, but the foundations were forever shaken. By afternoon, emergency meetings with remaining clients were underway. Explaining losses, reassuring stakeholders, and negotiating delays became the only battlefield left. Each conversation was a war of words, patience, and diplomacy. The firm's pride was gone, replaced with the raw reality of survival. Caldwell, exhausted but determined, realized the truth. We've been overconfident. We relied too much on past victories, on the illusion of control. The market doesn't care about our history. It punishes the unprepared. Caldwell nodded grimly, understanding that the lessons learned today were more valuable than any profit. Evening fell, and the firm finally exhaled. The immediate crisis had passed, though scars remained. Shaken confidence, lost clients, and reputational damage that could take months to repair. But the survivors, the ones still standing on the trading floor, knew they had endured something few firms ever faced. And somewhere high above the city, Daniel Mercer leaned back in his chair, watching the skyline with quiet satisfaction. He had played the invisible hand perfectly, forcing Halbrook and Pierce to confront their weaknesses, their overconfidence, and their blind trust in routine. The market had spoken, and it had delivered justice in the most precise and ruthless way possible. In the end, Halbrook and Pierce survived, but they were changed forever. Lessons learned in the furnace of pressure and chaos would shape every decision, every trade, every move from now on. And for Daniel Mercer, it was not the destruction of a rival that mattered most. It was the demonstration of power, precision, and inevitability. The market had its victor, and it had shown once again that survival required more than skill. It required clarity, discipline, and the courage to act when everything else seemed to crumble.